Hey up and welcome to a short episode of Last Cast. We're down here today at Bottom's Mill Dam just for the last couple of hours of a session that I've fished. We've just got Tom on the box now, and what I'm basically doing is he's looking to do a bit of feeder fishing in the next few weeks. So I'm just going to try and give him a few pointers as to how to go about feeder fishing. So what we've done, I've clipped up the rod at about sort of 30 metres, something like that, and put in 5 feederfuls of ground bait. Hopefully if we're lucky we'll catch a few bream, but the main thing is to run through the sort of techniques of casting and how to fish the feeder sort of from a basic standpoint. So it should be fairly straightforward. I've rigged it up with a 50 centimetre hook length, a 14 hook, and put a dendrobiner on there, and we've got a 30 gram bottom loaded distance feeder on there just to make casting easier, because he's only got a 9-foot rod, so for fishing that range it's just a bit easier than chucking, say, standard bottom loaded feeder. So like I said, we've chucked out and we're hoping we'll get a few indications. Might not be the case, but like I said, we'll just run through a few bits regarding feeder fishing, how to go about the casting, how to go about setting the tip and setting all your gear up and that sort of thing, and we'll take it from there. Right, so Tom's going to bring the feeder in now and go for a recast. So what we're going to do is we'll go for sort of 5-10 minute casts to start with. That's what I'd normally do fishing a peg like this, just to get a bit of bait down and get the fish used to the feeder going in. So what we'll run him through now is how to hold the rod, hold the hook bait and load the feeder correctly. Right. So now if you bring the hook bait into your right hand, so have it about level with the reel. What you've always got to do with this is hold the hook bait in your right hand, so the same or whichever hand you hold the rod with, and that'll just keep it out of the way when you're loading the feeder. So he's already got the hook bait on. Then it's just a case of going to the side tray, putting a few casters into the feeder, or whatever bait you want to run through the feeder. And then what I usually do is I'll have my ground bait usually on the left hand side, but my bait tray is a bit full, so it's on the right hand side today. Makes it easier to see. So you can see he's got some bait in the feeder there, and then he's just going to cap the feeder at both ends, so using thumb and forefinger to run it in from the top and the bottom of the feeder. And then what I do is, especially where it's shallow like this, is I'll mix it on the dry side and just give it one nice squeeze, and you'll feel the ground bait almost trying to push out of the feeder. So you don't want to pack it really tight like a rock hard ball, but just compress it enough so when it hits the bottom it'll explode out the feeder.
Should be alright, shouldn't it?
Yeah, that should be perfect.
Right.
So then when you want to cast, basically what you're looking to do is have about a 2-foot drop between the quiver tip and the feeder itself. You don't want it sort of 3-4 foot because you're liable to snag up behind you. Obviously when you're casting big feeders like this on fairly light rods, you need to make sure you're clear behind you where you're casting, and then when you bring the feeder back round, make sure it's a nice positive cast to basically lob the feeder out. You don't want to sort of flick the rod really hard, and almost like when you see some people when they float fishing, it's like they try and whip the float out. With a feeder rod, it's a case of basically compressing the rod when you bring it back, so bringing the feeder comfortably behind you.
Shall I do this standing up or?
Yeah, standing up's better, yeah. So bringing the feeder just behind you, so keep an eye on the quiver tip, make sure your line's not wrapped behind, then bring the feeder directly behind you, and then a nice punch out. There you go, it's hit the clip. So the main thing is when you're fishing to a clip like this, like Tom's done there, is hitting the clip with the rod above you. What that'll do is when you tighten down to the feeder, at least you've got a couple of turns on the reel then. That means if you do hook a big fish, then you can at least unclip, then you've got time rather than fishing right tight to the clip. So like Tom's done there, he's brought the feeder behind him, bang in line with the far bank marker, nice positive cast to get the feeder out there, hit the clip with the rod just behind you, and then bring the rod down. What you'll also do, and you'll notice, Tom, is when your feeder hits the clip, you'll be able to feel it down to the bottom. So yeah, you'll feel it hit when it's basically on a tight line and it's more prominent on a deeper venue. You'll feel the feeder down, and then when it hits bottom, the line will suddenly go slack, and then you know you've hit bottom. So now that feeder's gone down, because he's hit the clip, the hook bait will have gone just past the feeder. But what happens whenever you feeder fishing is that because the way the feeder sinks so quick, the hook bait will always land right next to the feeder. So what I've explained to Tom is what I tend to do is, especially on a venue like this where it's not snaggy, is once the feeder's settled like that, I'll bring the feeder back by a foot or 2 foot, somewhere around just less than how long the hook length is. So now that feeder's settled, it'll have started to break down. So if you just bring that feeder back towards you ever so slightly, so just drag the rod and then tighten up to it on the reel, and then you can put the rod down and set the tip.
Right.
Yeah, so what we'll have to do is bring that rod round a bit more to the left, see where there's a little divot in the keep net.
Does it matter if I drag it or?
No, it doesn't matter if you drag it a little bit more. And then just slacken off, so you've just got a very slight bend in the tip. Again, it varies depending what you're fishing for and the rigs that you're using, whether you fish a really tight line or a slack line. But what I tend to do 90% of the time is you want a slight bend in the tip. So if you look down the line of the rod, the tip should bend about an inch in offline from that. And that'll mean that you'll see any drop back bites, but crucially, if you get any line bites, the fish isn't feeling the resistance of the tip and spooking off. So you'll see a nice indication. You'll see all the bites and every little line bite that tells you fish around the feeder. And basically it's just a case of repeating the process. So every sort of 5-10 minutes, keep casting in, make sure the bait's going in into the peg. The way that I've explained to Tom is like when you float fishing, you've got to think of it the same. If you float fishing, you'll catapult out sort of every minute to 5 minutes. You've got to think the same when you feeder fishing. A lot of people, they'll chuck a feeder out and leave it for half an hour. Especially when it's in warmer conditions and there's bream, you need to keep casting the feeder in to get that bait going in and keep that column of bait going down. Now, one thing I've mentioned with the ground bait, usually I'll mix it on the dry side for fishing like this, but say you're fishing in deep water, mix it still on the dry side, compress it really hard so it'll go to the bottom and explode out the feeder, but occasionally it's worth trying just having a corner of your ground bait bowl where you've over wetted the mix. It goes a bit like a slop almost, so when you cast it out, basically it creates a cloud as it goes down through the water column, and that'll draw fish to the bottom. But today, because it's only sort of 3 foot deep, there's no need to do that. A really dry mix that'll explode out the feeder is what you need. So like I say, what we'll do now is we'll keep on casting and hopefully get a few indications. But every time Tom brings it in, we'll just run through the casting process. So like I say, we'll do that every five or so minutes, something like that, and see if we can get a few indications.
So when I do get a bite, what sort of thing are you looking for?
So when you get a bite on, what you're looking for is, well, with bream fishing, what you'll get is a lot of line bites where the tip will either slowly pull round and then drop back, or you'll have a couple of little sort of, the tip will almost wobble where a fish has swum into the line. With bream bites, what you tend to see is like a double movement on the tip. So you'll see as it pulls once and then it'll pull again, where basically the fish has picked up the hook bait, it's moved, you'll see that indication on the tip, and that'll be a slight indication, and then when it shakes its head, that's when you'll get a proper pull.
Right.
So if you're ever unsure when to strike into bream, that's when you need to do it. If you're roach fishing, you'll end up with rattles on the tip, and then you've just got to pick up. Because roach bites are completely different. They won't sort of pick up the bait and hold on to it.
So is it possible to get like a deep hooked fish still?
No, with bream, because when they turn, what it'll do, it'll tighten the hook into the corner of their mouth. So unless you're fishing a really long hook length, and the fish has got plenty of time to mouth the bait, stay around the feeder and then move off, where you won't see an indication, that's when you'll get a deep hooked fish. But because we're twitching the feeder back, that should straighten the hook length out behind it.
Right.
And that means that then when you get a bite, so the hook length still won't be bowstring tight from the feeder to the hook bait, it'll still have a curve to it, or it might bend round in sort of an S shape, but it means the fish doesn't have to move as far to show the indication.
Right, cool.
So the other thing as well is the hook length that you use. A lot of people use like a thin mono that's really supple.
Yeah.
Using a fluorocarbon hook length and a heavier hook length means that you'll get much more positive bites on the tip. So obviously it'll kick the hook length away from the feeder more, and it's less liable to land right next to the feeder. It should just kick it out ever so slightly. So when you're rigging up for feeder fishing, it's always worth just thinking about fishing a much heavier hook length than you would on the pole.
Right.
End of the day, it's lying on the bottom, so the fish aren't going to inspect it as much. So a nice strong hook length that's quite stiff, like fluorocarbon, like in this case we've got an 018 4-pound fluorocarbon hook length on. So if that was in mono, that'd be probably 6 or 7 pound. It'll kick the hook bait away from the feeder more.
Right. Because I know when you're like feeder fishing for like perch, you tend to get quite a few deep hooked fish. Why is that? What's the difference here?
That's
like you say, just because of the hook itself, or?
Yeah, it's the way that perch feed. What they'll tend to do is swallow a bait really quickly. So if you've got a slack line between if the hook bait's slack, then the fish has got plenty of time to mouth that bait before you see an indication. So with perch fishing, if I'm fishing for perch on a feeder, say, or if you're fishing the river, it's a case of chucking out and then making sure that you pull that feeder back toward you and straighten that hook length out.
Right.
So the best way to do it, if you drag the feeder too quick, then it'll kick the hook bait up and it'll land close to the feeder. If you drag it nice and slow, then it'll straighten the hook length out better.
Yeah, I never knew that, because like I've watched a few videos about method feeders, and when you're doing that, you don't want to move the feeder at all, do you?
No. It's a different thing when you're fishing with cage feeders. Thing is as well, if you're fishing say a cage feeder like this but a short hook length, then I wouldn't move the feeder.
Right.
Because like I say, it's all about making sure that your hook bait is as far away from the feeder as it can get on the length of line that you've got, so your line's tight, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you're fishing say a 12-inch hook length and the bream are coming straight to the feeder, your line will be tight enough, then the fish has only got to move a foot or half a foot to show the indication.
Right.
If you've got a 4-foot hook length and it's landed right next to the feeder, the fish has got to move at least 3 foot before you see an indication.
So how important is it as well to get it in the same spot? Obviously you need to get it around the area, but like, is it as important as method feeding to get it in the same spot?
Method feeder on commercials, it's different because you're fishing in much tighter areas at shorter ranges. For bream, if you're putting in 5 feederfuls, you need to make sure they all land on the money. Right. If you're putting in 30 feederfuls because you want to create an area, you might be aiming at an area the size of a snooker table. But in a case like today where we're putting 5 feederfuls, it's not a lot of bait. You've got to think it's, you know, you've only got sort of small nuggets of ground bait basically. You need to be within probably 2-3 foot of that initial feed to make sure you keep building that peg.
Yeah.
I say it depends how many fish you're fishing for and the size of shoal that you expect to arrive in the peg. But if you're chucking, say you're chucking on the same line every single time and you're landing it basically, you know, bang on the money every single time, if you start getting a lot of line bites then because the fish are coming straight to the feeder, either it's a case of changing to a method feeder or a really short hook length, or chucking sort of a foot, 2 foot to the right hand side, so it's out of the way of the initial bed of feed where the fish have got shoulder up and got their heads down.
Right.
So you're more likely then to get a proper indication because they're not attacking all of the loose particles on the bottom.
Yeah.
So it's something that you've got to suss out through the course of the session, is that.
Right.
So I think that's been about 5 minutes, so it's probably time to have a recast.
I agree.
So one thing as well that's worth noting is whenever you're picking up the feeder like Tom's done there, you'll see a lot of people just reel the feeder in. Now if there's risk of snags and that sort of thing, that's when you need to lift the rod, get the feeder way off the bottom, especially if you're fishing on rocky terrain. Lift the feeder right up off the bottom and then you can reel it in so you're out of any snags then.
So right hand.
So yeah, bait in the right hand. You can tighten up to that feeder just a little bit, it'll make life a bit easier. It's obviously the longer hook length that you use, the more difficult this is. But as long as you can get the feeder to your side tray to get your bait in, then in your ground bait bowl, that's the main thing. So obviously through the course of a session you can change what you're actually running through the feeder, so quite often I'll start off with say particles like casters, corn, maggots, micropellets, and I'll leave chopped worm out of the equation for the time being. If it turns out that the peg goes a bit funny and you need to draw fish back in, that's when you need to put the chopped worm back into the mix.
Right.
So but quite often...
We haven't put any chopped worm in yet, have we?
No.
No. Right. Let's give this a shot then.
So you can see it's about a 2 foot drop there between quiver tip and feeder. It's lined up with a far bank marker. Standing up makes it a lot easier, and then it's just a case of making a nice positive cast, making sure you hit the clip with plenty of time before the feeder hits the bottom.
Oh, bad cast that. That was horrendous. Jesus.
You can see the difference in that cast there. Tom hasn't hit the clip, and that's due to his casting technique there. It's something that requires a lot of practice, but he's basically flicked the feeder out there, which means that he hasn't compressed the rod, which will catapult the feeder out. Basically, when you're chucking feeders on a feeder rod, you need to get that rod to bend behind you, so if you sort of flick it like that, basically the rod's going to almost just whip, and that means that you're not going to get the distance. It's something that's very difficult to explain, but it's easier to sort of get the feel of it through practice. So when you're bringing the feeder back, bring it back a bit slow behind you, and then when you're punching the feeder out, a lot of it's in your left arm, so basically your right hand, you're not trying to sort of force it out with your right hand so much as pull the rod down with your left, which will basically create a pivot point on your right hand, which will then bend the rod to fire the feeder out.
Right. I think sometimes you can try too hard to cast it, can't
Yeah, you can try to cast it too hard, which will just mean, like I said, the rod basically whips and doesn't compress properly.
Yeah. Do you think it's just worth recasting it, or?
Well, what I'll do, it's a good point, is that if I make a bad cast, what I'll do is I won't just start reeling the feeder straight back in, because what that'll do is it'll create a massive area of feed behind the feeder as it's basically emptying itself as you drag it towards you. What you're better off doing is leaving it out for a couple of seconds, say sort of 30 seconds to a minute, something like that. Let the feeder break down. You've got a half chance of catching a fish there. But then when you bring the feeder back in, you've just got a nice tight pile of bait on the bottom that you've left, as opposed to a long trail that might be 6 feet further back towards you from where the feeder's landed, right. Which means you're creating an even bigger feed area.
Yes, and fish spread out more, don't they?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's better to leave a nice little tight area of feed in the wrong place than a big trail of feed all through your peg that'll basically disperse fish all over the place.
So would you say probably about now to just recast?
Yeah, so that feeder will have broken down now, so if you lift into the feeder, make sure it's clear of any obstructions and reel in. So you can see Tom's doing the right thing there. He's got the rods nice and high in the air, and that means that feeder's skimming across the surface, which is what you want. I say if you reel it in really slowly, then you're liable to hit branches and snags on the bottom.
Let's give this another shot then. It's harder than it looks.
It is, but it's a case of practicing, and that's the thing. A lot of people, what they do is they'll just chuck a feeder out and leave it for an hour. You need to be chucking every 5-10 minutes. Not only that, it'll get you practicing as well. Yeah. So basically it's just a case of going through the motions. So what you might want to do on this one is have a bit of a slower back cast. So when you're bringing the feeder behind you, what you'll feel is the feeder will basically swing behind you. You'll feel the rod actually compress behind you before you cast out.
Right.
So if you
bring it out, shouldn't it?
Basically, yeah.
Hopefully.
So if you swing the feeder behind you without actually casting this time, you'll just try and get a feel for how far back you need to be for the rod to start to compress.
Right. It's about there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry,
so when you basically swing it back towards you, you'll feel the rod almost bounce as it goes behind you, and that's when the rod's compressing. So it's basically like a loaded spring then, and that's when it'll fire the feeder out.
Let's go with this again then.
You can see there he's hit the clip comfortably.
A bit better, wasn't it?
So again, with that slower back cast, it means that the rod's got time to compress behind you, and that's when you'll feel, as you start to bring your left hand down, you'll feel the weight of the feeder before it casts out, and that'll tell you that you're making a good cast and the rod's actually compressing and it's going to cast properly. So on a shallow venue like this, like we're doing today, there's no point trying to sink the line, especially with mono. It'll sink itself anyway. As long as you keep a tight line to the feeder, you'll see the tip will be round until the line's sunk, and then it'll come back towards you, and that means your line's sunk.
So what do I do here now if I put the rod down and the line's on the clip?
So basically that's when you'll drag the feeder as well. So that's happened because obviously you've hit the clip with the rod further forward.
Right. So if I drag the feeder back a bit,
yeah, you'll get a turn on the reel.
Right.
But you'll also get now that the line's sunk as well.
Yeah. Should I tighten it back up and then drag it, or?
Just drag it first and then tighten up to it. So then you can imagine like what's happening under the water there. Your feeder's moved 30 centimetres or so. Your hook length should have stayed where it is, pretty much, or your hook bait should have done. And then you're just tightening up to the feeder. Rather than continuously moving it, so you tightened up and then you drag the feeder and then you tighten back up again.
Yeah.
And then twitch the feeder to make sure your tip was set right. Once you've moved that feeder to where you're happy with, then it's a case of setting your tip.
Right.
So like in this case, I'd probably slacken that off just a little bit because you've got a bit too much of a bend in the tip. And that'll mean that it's set perfectly. So you can see you've just got a very slight bend in the tip there.
Is that what you want every time?
Yeah.
Right.
So there's sometimes when, say you're fishing on a really silty bottom with a light feeder and you want the fish to hook themselves, you'll tighten right up to it, or occasionally you might have it where, say there's a massive tow on the water, in which case you're setting the tip like you would do on a river, so you'd have it have a bow to the feeder, but you'd have a tight line basically, and you're looking for dropbacks. But 90% of the time that won't be the case. You'll usually just have to set the tip same as that.
Right. And that was a bit better than last time, I know.
Yeah. I say it's just a case of practicing.
Yeah. Hit the clips, I know it's gone in right anyway.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Because you notice when you hit the clip, it's just more of a plop when the feeder goes in, rather than when you didn't hit the clip and it sort of crashes into the water. And the problem is with that, obviously your hook bait's behind the feeder from the casting, so it can actually tangle the rig.
Yeah.
Whereas when your feeder hits the clip in the air, it'll send your hook bait past the feeder, which means it lands beyond the feeder and then swings in.
So if you hit the clip, it's like 95% chance it's going to be in right, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty much 100% chance.
Right.
If you hit the clip, basically your feeder will stop in the air, but your hook bait's still obviously on a slack line, so that'll go past the feeder, and then it lands beyond the feeder. So what you're looking for on the water when you cast is the plop of the feeder, and then you'll see your hook bait just behind it.
Right.
And then you know that your rig's not tangled.
Yeah. It's one of the main things, isn't it?
Yeah. If it goes in one heap, then it's, you know, you've probably missed your cast anyway and you've not hit the clip.
Yeah.
So it's worth, just like I said earlier, giving it a minute to empty and then bringing the feeder back in and re-chucking. Because there's no point wasting a cast in a bad area, especially when you've like established a feed area with your initial feed of say 5 or 6 feederfuls.
Yeah. How much of a difference can it make if you have, like, say you have 3 casts and you're not in the area? How much of a difference can that make?
Depends how much proportion-wise that is to your initial feed.
Right.
So if you've put 20 feederfuls in the right area and then 3 that have missed, it's not too bad. If you put 5 feederfuls in and then missed with 3 casts, then it's a bit of a difference.
Yeah. So it's like, it's hard to explain, but you've got like, say you got, I don't know.
Well, like I say, if you've got say 20 feederfuls in, call that a pint of bait and it's in the right area.
Yeah.
The way that I always look at it is, imagine if you're pole fishing and you put in 10 balls of ground bait, bang in the same place, and then you put 3 scattered around your peg. It's not going to make too much difference. But if you put in 2 balls that are bang on the money and 3 elsewhere, then the fish are more likely to, well, you're basically splitting your fish, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because you've got different feed areas.
That's less likely to hook one then, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we can get a bite now then.
Hopefully so.
It's looking pretty quiet.
Yeah, well, it's not fished well today, has it?
No.
But you notice the difference when you do bring the feeder back slower, and it's not a case of you trying to sort of flick the feeder out.
Yeah, that was my problem with that peg, because I couldn't bring it back far enough.
Yeah.
It was well annoying. So you end up flicking it then.
But basically, like, you get used to having your right hand, so when you're casting, your right hand should never move from, like, basically from where your ear is to probably about there. So your right hand never goes to full extension.
Yeah.
Unless you're chucking a really long way. It's all in your left arm, basically bringing the butt of the rod round to send the feeder out.
Do you ever use like maggots on hook, or do they normally work? Or
It depends what I'm fishing for. If it's bream like this and I'm not putting worm through the feeder and I want to try and get bites quickly, I'll put a worm on the hook because it's a change bait and it's something that, you know, all fish will go for.
Yeah.
If it ends up being the case that I've had a few fish and then it starts fishing harder and I know the fish are still in the peg, that's when I'll scale down my hook bait size. So that's when I'll go down to say 2 casters or 2 maggots or something like that.
Right.
But usually when you've put your initial feed in, a target hook bait's better. Because you've got to imagine you've got loads of different particles in the mix, haven't you? So you've got bits of corn, caster, little food items. If there's one big worm sat there, they're more likely to go for that. Once they've worked their way through the feed, so then you've ended up with like this. So you put in 100 casters to start with, and then they've eaten their way through, and then there's 10 left. If you put in a caster, then you've got a 1 in 10 chance of catching on the hook. Whereas if you put that in initially, you'd have a 1 in 100 chance of them picking out your caster. So that's why you use a change bait to start and a target bait, and then scale down as the day goes on.
Right. Sometimes if you put maggots on as well, you get a roach pestering you, don't you?
Well, that's the thing as well, like when you've put your initial feed in, you'll end up with a bit of a cloud and you can end up with small fish in your peg then, until the bigger fish come in and move them out.
Right. And you can normally tell, can't you, if you're getting loads of little knocks, it's normally roach to start with, isn't it?
in which case then it might be, might be the time to switch to a method feeder and a pellet or something like that, or scale up your hook bait, say put 2 bits of corn on a size 12 if you're targeting the bream.
Yeah, we don't need to worry about that now though.
No, not yet.
It's only a matter of time.
Right, so we've done about an hour here coaching Tom through the sort of like a beginner's guide to feeder fishing as he's just getting into it. So what we've covered today basically is just been how to chuck sort of a traditional feeder rig, basically the ins and outs of cage feeder fishing on a venue like this where it's nice and shallow. But what we'll do, because Tom's wanting to get into more feeder fishing now, is what we'll do is we'll go to sort of like commercial fisheries, a variety of fisheries, and basically run him through different styles of feeder fishing. So say method feeder fishing, pellet feeder fishing, and all the things that go with that. So what we'll do is we'll hopefully start to build like his skill set on feeder fishing, so he'll be able to apply it to various different venues, whether it's say cage feeder fishing on commercials or method feeder fishing on natural venues even as a change. So we'll probably wrap it up there, but it's been a good little hour's stint, something like that, and hopefully, like I say, we'll just keep building on Tom's experience in terms of how to cast the feeder, load the feeder, and like I say, all the ins and outs of feeder fishing. So hopefully it's been of use to you folks at home. And as always from Last Cast, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on that next episode.